Roughly 4,800 years ago, in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates, a Sumerian household was doing something that had absolutely nothing to do with getting clean. They were cooking. And like every kitchen before and since, that cooking left behind grease, animal fat rendered from a slaughtered sheep or goat, and ash, the leftover residue of the fire that cooked it. At some point, water, fat, and wood ash ended up mixed together, maybe from washing out a cooking pot, maybe from rain running through a hearth. And instead of just making a mess, that combination did something considerably more useful. It started to lather. Nobody in that kitchen was trying to invent a cleaning product, but the alkali in the ash had reacted with the fat in a slow chemical process that modern chemists now call saponification. And the result was something that actually lifted grease off surfaces instead of just spreading it around. The Sumerians wrote the recipe down. A clay tablet dated to around 2500 BC describes boiling fat with ash, which makes it one of the earliest chemical formulas ever recorded by human beings, older than most of the science we consider ancient. And that one unglamorous kitchen accident, fat plus ash plus water, eventually became the single most widely manufactured hygiene product on Earth. The seed from which every bar of soap, every bottle of shampoo, and eventually every synthetic detergent on the planet would grow. So, how did humans get from a greasy Sumerian cooking pot to the bar sitting next to your sink right now? The answer runs through Babylonian medicine, a Roman myth that turns out to be almost entirely false, a golden age of Islamic chemistry that perfected the hard bar we'd actually recognize today, and a 19th century industrial race to solve a shortage nobody outside of chemistry ever hears about. Let's start with the chemistry itself, because understanding what's actually happening in that lather explains why almost every civilization on Earth eventually stumbled onto some version of the same discovery independently. Fat, at the molecular level, is built from long chains called fatty acids attached to a small backbone molecule called glycerol. When you introduce a strong alkali, in ancient times that meant the lye leached out of wood ash, and add heat, the alkali breaks those fatty acid chains loose from the glycerol entirely. Each freed fatty acid then pairs up with a sodium or potassium ion from the ash. And that new molecule is soap. What makes that molecule special is that one end of it is attracted to water, and the other end is attracted to oil, which means a single soap molecule can grab onto grease with one side and get rinsed away by water with the other. That's the entire secret behind everything soap would eventually be used for, whether that meant scrubbing wool in a Bronze Age river or scrubbing a surgeon's hands in a 19th century hospital. In its earliest uses, this soap-like substance wasn't a hygiene product at all. Sumerian and Babylonian tablets describe it being used almost exclusively to clean wool and prepare textiles for weaving, not to wash human bodies. A recipe from the reign of the Babylonian king Nabonidus in the 6th century BC even specifies the mixture was meant for washing stones on behalf of servant girls, which tells you this was industrial cleaning, not personal care. For centuries, ordinary people across Mesopotamia and Egypt encountered this substance primarily as a laundry aid. Exactly the kind of unglamorous domestic application you'd expect from something first noticed in a cooking fire rather than deliberately engineered for the human body. Egypt developed its own parallel tradition. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical text from around 1550 BC, describes combining animal and vegetable oils with an alkaline salt to treat skin conditions, meaning Egyptians were using something soap-like as medicine well before anyone used it primarily to bathe. And this is where one of the most persistent myths about soap's origin needs to be addressed directly, because it's wrong in a genuinely interesting way. For generations, popular retellings have claimed soap was discovered by accident at a place called Mount Sapo near Rome, where animal sacrifices left fat and ash to wash down into the Tiber River, and washerwomen supposedly noticed their laundry got cleaner downstream. It's a great story. It also appears to be almost entirely fictional. No archaeological or geographical evidence of an actual Mount Sapo has ever been found, and the tale doesn't show up anywhere until centuries after it supposedly happened. The word Sapo does appear in Pliny the Elder's Natural History around 77 AD, but Pliny doesn't credit Mount Sapo at all. He describes soap as a Gallic invention, made from tallow and ash, used more by Germanic men to style their hair than by Roman women to clean anything. Most linguists now think the word itself was simply borrowed from an early Germanic language, related to the Latin word for tallow, rather than named after a hillside that never existed. So the popular origin myth for the word soap turns out to be almost exactly as accidental and almost exactly as fake as the substance's real discovery was genuine, which is a strange kind of historical irony on its own, once gunpowder-style hyperbole is set aside. The real engine of soap's development wasn't Rome at all. It was the Islamic world, roughly between the 8th and 12th centuries, during what's often called the Islamic Golden Age. This is where soap stopped being an accidental byproduct and became a deliberately engineered chemical product. The 9th century chemist Jabir ibn Hayyan documented methods for extracting caustic soda, giving soap makers for the first time a real understanding of the alkali they'd been using instinctively for thousands of years. Around the same period, in the Syrian city of Aleppo, craftsmen combined olive oil and laurel berry oil with that refined alkali to produce something genuinely new. A hard, dry, transportable bar of soap that could be shipped, stored, and traded, rather than a soft paste that had to be used on the spot. That Aleppo soap, still made today using essentially the same process, is widely considered the ancestor of the modern bar soap sitting in your bathroom. A parallel industry developed in Nablus, in the region now known as Palestine, where local artisans combined olive oil with a plant-based alkali to produce Nabulsi soap, a nearly scentless ivory-colored bar that by the 14th century had grown into a major regional industry employing entire families. There were religious as well as commercial reasons this technology matured here specifically. Islamic practice required ritual washing before daily prayer, and the hammam, the public bathhouse, was already a central feature of Islamic urban life, which meant there was sustained structural demand for a reliable washing product in a way that simply didn't exist yet in post-Roman Europe. And that gap matters, because Europe had actually fallen backward. After the fall of Rome, regular bathing declined sharply across much of the continent, and whatever soap-making knowledge had existed grew cruder and less consistent. The reintroduction of high-quality hard soap into Western Europe came largely through contact during the Crusades in the 11th through 13th centuries, as European soldiers encountered Aleppo-style soap in the Levant and carried the knowledge home with them. Mediterranean cities with ready access to olive oil, particularly in Spain, Italy, and southern France, became the new centers of soap production. Guilds formed in Naples by the 12th century, and towns like Marseille and Savona built entire local economies around soap manufacturing, eventually giving their names to soap styles still sold today. Marseille soap and Castile soap among them, both built on the same basic olive oil and lye formula the Islamic world had already perfected centuries earlier. For hundreds of years after that, soap making stayed a slow, expensive, small batch craft. The main obstacle wasn't the fat. Animal tallow and vegetable oils were widely available. It was the alkali. Usable alkali still had to be laboriously extracted from wood ash or imported seaweed ash, and by the 13th century, deforestation across parts of Europe had already made wood ash a genuinely scarce and expensive resource. England went so far as to tax soap directly for over a century, treating a basic hygiene product as a luxury good right up until the mid-1800s, which meant that for most of European history, soap simply wasn't something an ordinary household used often. This alkali shortage became such a serious industrial bottleneck that in 1783, the French Academy of Sciences offered a cash prize to anyone who could figure out how to manufacture alkali directly from ordinary sea salt instead of scarce plant ash. A French chemist named Nicolas Leblanc solved it in 1791, developing a multi-step process that converted salt into soda ash using sulfuric acid, limestone, and coal. It should have made him wealthy. Instead, the French Revolution broke out before he could collect his prize money, his factory was seized by revolutionary authorities, and Leblanc died by suicide in 1806. Having handed the entire soap and glass industries a foundational technology he never profited from himself. It's a genuinely brutal footnote sitting right in the middle of soap's success story. The Leblanc process and the cheaper Solvay process that eventually replaced it decades later finally broke the ancient alkali bottleneck for good, making the core ingredient of soap cheap and abundant for the first time in human history. At almost the same moment, the chemistry itself finally got explained properly. In 1823, the French chemist Michel-Eugen Chevreul published research demonstrating exactly what was happening at the molecular level when fat met alkali, describing the split into glycerol and fatty acid salts that we now call saponification. For the first time, soap makers weren't just following an inherited recipe. They understood the actual reaction they were running, which let them start deliberately engineering different soaps for different purposes rather than relying on centuries of trial and error passed down through guilds. That understanding collided with the Industrial Revolution to produce the soap industry as we'd actually recognize it today. Companies like Procter & Gamble, founded in Cincinnati in 1837, and Lever Brothers in England, founded in 1885, brought steam-powered machinery and mass production to a craft that had barely changed in 1,000 years. And this is where soap's history closes an almost poetic loop, because one of the most famous soap origin stories of the modern era turns out to be exactly as mythologized as Mount Sapo was in ancient Rome. For well over a century, Procter & Gamble told the public that their flagship ivory soap floated because of a happy accident. A factory worker in 1879 supposedly left a mixing machine running too long, whipping extra air into a batch that should have been discarded, and customers loved the buoyant result so much the company made it standard. It's a charming story about turning a mistake into a bestseller. In 2004, the company's own archivist found a notebook entry from company chemist James Gamble, dated years before the supposed accident, in which Gamble wrote plainly that he'd figured out how to make soap float and intended to manufacture the entire product line that way going forward. The beloved accident had actually been deliberate engineering all along, quietly rebranded decades later into a more charming story about serendipity. Soap's history, in other words, opens with a real accident nobody meant to have, and closes commercially with a fake accident everybody wanted to believe. Looking back across the entire arc, from a Sumerian cooking fire nearly 5,000 years ago to a factory floor in Cincinnati, the story of how humans invented soap is really a story about slow, unglamorous accumulation rather than any single flash of genius. Nobody set out on day one to invent hygiene. Someone noticed that fat and ash and water did something useful together, and for most of the next 4,000 years, soap stayed a laundry aid, a medicine, a luxury tax target, and a craft guild secret, refined in small increments by Sumerian tablet writers, Egyptian physicians, Islamic chemists, crusader traders, French chemists chasing a government prize, and eventually industrialists chasing a mass market. Each group solved a specific problem the previous group had left behind: the alkali shortage, the unstable soft paste, the unexplained chemistry, the impossibility of scale, until an accidental kitchen byproduct became something so completely ordinary that almost nobody thinks about it while washing their hands.